Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us wherever you are, whether it's morning, afternoon, or night. We really do appreciate you being online to discuss everything around property and the changes that are coming to real estate as we know it. We are very excited to have Professor Viruli with us this evening. Good evening, Professor, and welcome. Thank you for giving us your time.
Pleasure.
Scott is going to be asking him all the hot questions, but as usual, I'm going to be in the background monitoring the questions and answers, so please do pop them into the chat box. We will make sure that Scott and Professor have time to answer it as we go along. And in the meantime, we have got people from all over the world who have signed up for this webinar. We've been blown away by the different countries and places where people are coming to us from. But we'd love to know tonight exactly where you are. So please pop that into the chat box, say hi, join in the conversation, and make this really as interactive as you can. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Scott. Welcome, Scott. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. We really appreciate it. And yeah, always very exciting to be with the Prof and to get all of his insights in terms of where the world is and where we're going in this industry. Just before we get started, I wanted to share with you just a few things. Tonight's webinar or today's webinar, wherever you are in the world, is around the whole concept of location, 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 and the whole discussion around, is it still the most important factor in real estate? I was on a very interesting conference this morning, and some people love this new digital world and some people hate it. One of the things I love is that I don't have to travel to be part of it. And on the Rotarium conference this morning, I thought I would share with you a couple of highlights. China was the only economy in the world to grow in Q2. The risk of load shedding in South Africa is high, according to Eskom, until the end of next year. Travel will only be coming back by 2022. This is according to, you can see Estienne de Klerk there as the head of Growth Point. They had Nikki Weimer, that's the chief economist at Nedbank, and Dawie Root, that's equally an economist. Estienne de Klerk, from a Growth Point perspective, reckons they've written down between 5 to 8 billion in discounts, that online is still only about 5% of the market, and yet vacancies in office are up 13%. Industrial's the darling. The hospital fund is one of the only ones that's paid out this year. The data center market is quite a strong sector, and there's massive discounts in the REITs, according to him. The poor economy is not a friend of real estate, and one that I enjoyed learning about based on what we discussed last week with Ray Dalio was apparently 60% of the British war debt was paid off by just printing money and inflation. And then one that's really relevant, I believe, for tonight is that Dawie Root spoke about the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary sector. The primary market being farming and agriculture, the secondary market being offices and retail, etc., and the tertiary market being all about the services industry, and how we really are now embracing the fourth revolution. It's all about digitization, and really what we're going to be talking a lot about tonight is the industry of property or real estate, depending on how you know it, and how it's actually changing with regards to technology. And the final thought that I took away from this morning's conference was, if everyone is thinking the same, then someone is not thinking, which I quite enjoyed. And I just wanted to share with you, once we've been through with Prof. Viruli and everything that he's going to share, I will run a quick session at the end to discuss some of the concepts which we've been talking about now for a long time, 18 months or more, around Wealth 5.0, how the world is changing in terms of impact, creativity, high touch, high tech, digital. We will give people an opportunity to invest in both the company and or the platform where there are discounts off the valuation, and a way to earn in dollar terms a 7 to 10% income where your capital is actually protected. And really for me, the question you've got to ask yourself is that there's that great saying by Wayne Gretzky that was the greatest ice hockey player ever. And he said, a good hockey player plays to where the puck is. A great hockey player plays to where it's going. And tonight we're going to be talking a lot about where's this industry going, what is changing, and what are the long-term trends that people need to know about. I'm going to share with you about meta marketplaces and some of the changes that have taken place. And in many ways, 20 years ago, Amazon sat in a very similar situation with the dot-com boom bust. And we always believe that there's an opportunity now for the Amazon of personal wealth. And then the last two things that I'll say before I hand over is that it's so interesting what's happening in the press. So many different articles. We've done a number of different webinars. If you're interested in in what's been happening, in the press and the tech, if you want to understand what's happening with exponential organizations and why there's actually a formula where there's certain businesses that are literally 10x their competitors. And it's a mixture between the trends from a digital perspective, which we're going to be, the prof is going to be sharing with us tonight, and how it's impacting this industry of property or real estate. It's not only impacting property or real estate, it's impacting all industries, but then equally some of the principles of an EXO, exponential organization. But without further ado, I'm very, very excited, and as Lee mentioned, to invite the professor to join us. When I look at it here, the professor has many, many different degrees, with a BA in development economics, in industrial sociology, a property economist with over 20 years analysis of the South African property market. He lectures in urban economics, property development, and portfolio management at the University of Cape Town, of construction economics and management. I must just point out that I graduated from that school in 1998. So it's 22 years later that one of his students is actually talking about this. And one thing that I do find funny is that I actually did my dissertation in 1998 on how technology was going to change the property and construction industry, which was a bit ahead of its time, I think. He's been the chief economist at the Chamber of Mines and was the head of the research at JHI Professional Services, and more recently head of the School of Construction Economics and Management at the University of Witwatersrand, and is presently an associate professor at the University of Cape Town. And as I hand over to you, Prof, I thought that I would start just with this little article that you actually wrote a while ago. It came out in June 2017, and it was from a reporter that actually reported what you were saying at the SAPOA, which is the South African Property Owners Association. And you said that it's no longer only about location, location, location. It's now about technology, 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 and data, 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 according to yourself. You went on to say, data is now the world's most valuable commodity. It is argued that the next industry leaders will be organizations that can filter and analyze data to guide their business decisions. And so without further ado, I just wanted to welcome you and say it's a huge honor and a privilege to have you here tonight to understand what is happening to this industry that we all love. Yes, COVID's had an impact, but what is actually taking place with the long-term trends? And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand back to yourself.
Well, thank you very much. And let me just start sharing my screen so that we are there. And Lee, could you just confirm that it's all working? Huh?
We can see it.
Excellent, excellent. And Scott, believe it or not, that was an article in 2017 that I still believe in. Huh? I do change my mind as things go along, and as the well-known economist John Maynard Keynes said, when the facts change, I change my views. And quite rightly in that respect. So it's great to be with all of you across different time zones. I'm not going to say good evening, although it's a beautiful evening in Cape Town at the moment. And
well, I mean, just Prof, to put in perspective, we've got the Pacific Northeast, we've got Cape Town, Joburg, Moscow, Namibia, Botswana, Switzerland, California, Alberton. So anyway, Mumbai, Kenya. So just to give you an idea of where you've got people.
Scott, if we're going to talk about location, I think we're talking about the globe this evening. Exactly. We are just about everywhere. What I'd like to discuss in the few minutes that I have is, the old adage about location, and location is everything. But I think what we're starting to pick up in the property market is that location is important, but location can change very quickly on us. And I think that's where you have to be increasingly nimble in choosing the areas that you go to, finding the geographic areas. And I think what we're also starting to learn is that you can be in the right location, but in the wrong sector. So it's really a balance of trying to find the two. But let me start. Wait, let me just see. Can we predict the future? With difficulty. Here is, for those of you who've been to Cape Town or from Cape Town, this was a little drawing made in 1976, and this is what Cape Town should have looked like by now. Well, many of you will say it's a good thing it doesn't look like that. It probably looks a bit more like Rio and somewhere else, and the unfinished highway is not there for those of you who know Cape Town or have been here. So, as I always say, risk we can measure, but in any forecast, there is still this niggling uncertainty. The one thing we can't put a number to. The one thing that comes from where we're not quite sure. We had our forecasts in property, and I think we all had views of where we were going, and then suddenly things started looking a bit different. So what can we wisely do to think about the future of property and where we should be? And the one thing I've used, and I use it with my students, you will see little boxes here. So social, technological, environmental, economic, and political. So of course, for students who need to remember things for exam, we just call it STEEP, S-T-E-E-P. And I think in any forecasting, and I tend to do less forecasting in my life at the moment and more a bit of scenario planning. I think scenario planning is probably takes a bit of uncertainty into account and worth looking at. So the first point that you see here is our evolving relationship with space. Many of us have come out of COVID, having lived in a flat for a few months, where suddenly you start thinking about your own space, the space that you're living in, and the space around us. And I think the important thing, and Scott, I think you made an excellent point about technology. You'll see that my presentation is going to talk about technology as well. Why? Because the location that we have dealt with over the last decades was about the car. The car determined the shopping center. The idea behind the shopping center was that we'll have all these people in cars and they'll all drive to an out-of-town shopping center. And of course, that led to the demise of the department store in many cities around the world. The high street, there's been long debates about the high street. Of course, the world is not going to stop with the shopping center. I think it would be naive. It would be a bit like saying the world was going to stop with the department store. There is something that comes in after that. And I think what is going to happen now is that IT, the internet, the fourth industrial revolution is fundamentally going to change the way that we're going to think about space. You know, the point that I often make is that globalization for many decades affected the factory worker. The factory worker who suddenly saw goods being produced in China. It never really affected the office worker. And I think that the next step in globalization is going to be a globalization that is going to move from the factory floor to the office. In other words, the office worker, whether I use my accountant down the road or I use an accountant somewhere else in the world, as long as they follow King 4 and a few other things, I don't really mind. And I think that's where the challenge is going to be, that we're going to have offices in all parts of the world operating very differently in the globalization that we've had. So we'll talk about the organization of work. And I think the big word is going to be flexibility. It's going to be the flexibility of going to your work or staying at home. And coming from an emerging country like South Africa, we've got to accept that for a lot of people, working from home is far from ideal. When it's you and 3 children around the table, it's not so ideal. If you're in your Juji office at home, it's maybe a very different experience. Technology I've spoken about, the fourth industrial revolution, which I'll talk about in a moment. Transportation, how we think about transport, and much of our thinking, like I said, had to do about the car. Transportation with the car, maybe with the bus. How we think about space is going to alter. Finally, I think, not finally, but then we move on to the environmental. I believe in the next 10 years, location will also be becoming important because ESG issues, environmental, social and governance issues are going to be critical. Many investors in Europe at the moment will not touch companies, properties that don't have some sort of ESG rated environmental. So will the future be about plowing up green fields, or will the future in property be much more about reusing what we have, or certainly more brownfield? I'll talk about tech firms in a moment and prop tech, one of my favorite topics. From homebound economies to Fordism, we've seen the economy move from working from home. Then we had the first industrial revolution. We started putting everybody in factories and in offices. And I think we have a pretty good shot at the moment of changing it. And I think the important thing for property there is that our suburbs have a new opportunity. I think for many, the suburb was where you lived. I think our suburbs are going to become more exciting places with office, neighborhood shopping centers. As they're saying in Paris at the moment, you will live 15 kilometers from just about everything that you need around you. And that's probably a walking the distance. It's bringing everything much closer together. We've spoken about globalization. The role of government in the economy, I think we've seen it in post-COVID. We've seen government come into the economy, supporting our economy through infrastructural expenditures. But let's not underestimate, especially for those of you in emerging countries, that our local governments could come under growing pressure, fiscal pressure as well. Choosing the right cities is going to be very important. As budgets start being cut at national levels, you can be assured that it flows down to the municipal level as well. So let's move on then. And the reason I show this is for a very specific reason. If we go through our revolutions, our first revolution was around the agrarian, the early industrial world. We've always had property. We've just moved from a rural population to urbanization, to suburbanization as we move to the second. Then we had this urban renaissance to the third industrial revolution. And I think what we're going to see under the next level as the fourth industrial revolution moves forward is an urban dispersal. In other words, where suddenly everything was focused on the CBD, where suddenly new opportunities are going to arise out of the CBDs themselves. In smaller towns, the ability, as I saw a quote in The Economist, or somebody said, I live in a tiny little flat to work in a tiny little office. And I thought that was quite a nice way of putting it. Maybe there's an opportunity to live in a decent home a bit further away. And maybe
in that space, I expected with COVID for prices to be going down in places like where I live in Knysna and Plet, and actually they're going up because more and more people are realizing they don't have to live in Joburg and Pretoria and whatever, and they're moving down here, and they're selling their properties in Cape Town and Joburg and Pretoria, and they've actually got a lot more money to buy in this area now. So it's happening already and happening at speed.
No, absolutely, Scott. And I think that the secondary towns are going to start offering some very exciting opportunities. It touches completely on the idea of location, where I think many of us are sitting at home saying, I could maybe live somewhere else. That question wasn't asked. And I think it leads to an important point that, Scott, you're also making here. And that is, COVID-19 is, of course, a humanitarian disaster. And I think we can all... that's not what I'm questioning. But what I am saying is that COVID-19 maybe gave us the preview or the trailer about the future. It gave us that, we may go back to our bad habits and go back to the office, but I think it gave us a preview of what is possible. And many things where a year ago would have been no-nos have suddenly become possible. Imagine we're walking into an office a year ago and saying, you know what, let's tell all the staff to go home. I mean, you'd be kicked out of the boardroom within 5 minutes. You'd be asked, at my age, they would ask me to retire early. But but suddenly things that were not possible have become possible. And I think that's the exciting thing that is coming out. Many things that we believed in, that we thought this is the way we do property, is suddenly starting to look different. Maybe some of our CBDs will have a stronger focus on the residential sector rather than the office sector. That's also a possibility. Now, being a professor, I'm used to double periods, so I tend to talk fairly slowly. So I'm going to move on, because otherwise Scott at some point is going to say to me, or Lee is going to say, no, we don't have all night here. Now, downturns we've seen in the property, and I just need to say something about this. For example, if we go to the global, you'll see the big downward movements. And again, I'm taking the South African property market here, but in fact, South Africa did fairly well in 2008 in the global financial crisis. We saw strong downward turn in the property market, really real GDP growth, and the property market going down in 2008. The question is, are we going to see this as well? We might, but I think the important issue here is not that we go down, but it's going to be the length of the recession. That's the important thing. It's not to go up and down we've had, and property markets find their way back. But the longer the recession takes, the more you will start seeing structural changes, different players entering, others exiting the property market. Tenants finding it increasingly difficult. So, and I think that's one of the challenges, and certainly, and I don't want, and I know many of you are not in South Africa, so I'm not going to spend too much time, but I think in the South African game, remember this little yellow box here, which shows the cyclical downturn of the economy, which is the biggest. We've now got 73 months in a cyclical downturn since December 2003, actually. Sorry. Since 2013, not 3. And it's that length that becomes the important issue that starts altering the economy. So what sectors should we be looking at? If things are going to change, if locational decisions are going to change, and again, this is the MSCI number for South Africa, but I'll show you at the moment, these trends are trends that we're probably seeing globally at the moment. The darling of the sector has certainly been the industrial sector. Why? And it's not even industrial, it's probably logistics. That's where e-retailing. And some may argue that industrial is the new shopping center. You know, the new space that you need, that you will find it in the industrial sector. And then you'll see residential at 7.9 there, and then retail at 7.6 down, and office at 6.8. But there are variations. You'll, for example, see in the next block that community shopping centers are showing the strongest performance at the moment, with industrial office, and your darling regional shopping center that everybody loved is actually at the bottom of the list. So what we're starting to see these locational issues playing themselves out. And the point that I want to make here is this is not just a COVID-19 story. This was starting to play itself out in 2019 already. You know, so I think there were trends that Scott and others were picking up already, well before the COVID-19, and picking up those locational areas become important. And I think that if we believe that our neighborhoods are going to become more and more important, our suburbs, then of course the community shopping center will benefit out of that as you walk through your home. And the other interesting issue, of course, is who says that a shopping center only needs shops? I think that our shopping centers, small ones, are going to start looking like main streets, and we'll have you'll have your lawyer, your dentist, and maybe next to the dentist, the sweet shop, all next door to each other, which we want to look at. Okay. The one thing from a location that I often make is choose your city and choose them carefully. Because a city that isn't doing well, you will start seeing your operating costs going through the roof. especially your property taxes. I must assure you that in certain South African cities, we have property taxes rising by 10% with an inflation of 3%. And that's where things start going wrong. And of course, you often don't have much influence over that. So what I'm saying, look at the balance sheet of the city, which can play a very important role in the operating costs. In fact, in the South African case, combined percentage of total operating costs, 62.3%, all rising at a rate faster than the inflation rate. So just to leave the short term, and then I want to move on to a few other things. This is the property clock. I've done a lot of research over the years and written academic papers, and the only thing that people are really interested in is this clock that I don't know what, I thought of this on a Sunday or something, and this seems to have picked up the imagination. So I suppose I could ask you all, where do you think we are on this clock? And maybe you could put up whether you think it's 3 or 6 o'clock. And of course you will say, well, it depends by sector, and it depends by town, and it depends, and you're quite right. You know, it varies quite considerably, and different sectors will be at different points. As a student said to me 2 years ago, is this AM or PM? And I had to say, well, it doesn't really matter. But anyway, I suppose he was just checking whether I knew my stuff. But the thing is that I think that most of the property market is probably sitting in this world here of rent process in this saturated market. And the market is tightening up again. And so, you know, what I do believe is that during the course of the next 6 months, and this is where interesting opportunities, of course, arise, because some investors are under pressure to sell at the moment. And I'm just seeing some numbers that came out this morning showing that actually institutional investors and private investment in property is on the rise. And it's on the rise for a simple fact that I always make the point, there's something for everyone in the property market. When some of your REITs, your bigger investors, have to get out of certain properties for whatever reason, that offers new opportunities for those entering the market. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see some of the investment opportunities that are going to start arising coming out of the environment at the moment. Valuations have come under pressure, and I can tell you, for anybody who was valuing a property about a few months ago, we had the RICS putting a practice alerts out and some finding the new ways. Yes, and I must be honest, it all depended on when your financial year was coming to the end and when you did your valuations. The problem is, and I suppose the important point to remember is that I suppose a 5-year discounted cash flow on property is tight. Often it's 10 years. These are investments for the long run. You know, this is not an investment to go in, you know, for a year. I think the idea is to play these cycles. And as I've often said in property, we have a major property cycle every 20 years. You've got 2 big shots in your career to make serious money out of property. If you miss the first one, you have a second one. And I suppose if you miss both, you become a professor at a university. No, but no, you know, there are some major trends that you've got to bear into account. But the most important is that those 20-year booms are not GDP booms. Those are structural changes in the property market. In the South African case, 60s was about the growth of business. The 80s was about decentralization. The 2000s, fair enough, the structural changes through the REIT structures and others that were coming up. But I think where it becomes interesting is that we're picking up structural changes, as I mentioned, in the property sector at the moment. And it is those structural changes that are much more important in the boom of the property market than necessarily the short-term GDP changes. So the Urban Land Institute, and for those of you not in South Africa, you may find this interesting, and I've been testing this in South Africa as well, saying if we believe in all of this, what are the sectors to go for? Well, the Urban Land Institute put this out for 2020. We're just going to get the new figures coming out fairly soon. But number one, logistics. Then we move into retirement homes. Again, long-term view, we have aging populations around the world, certainly in the industrialized world, offering all sorts of opportunities when you just look at the demographics and you follow. And then you'll see that your co-living, private rented, residential, student housing, affordable housing, healthcare comes up very hard. Then the interesting new sector, data centers for the IT world. And then we start moving down into some of the other sectors. But and what becomes also interesting, and I'll talk about it in a moment, is that why are many offices here and out of town shopping centers sitting in the lower parts? And I think I may just have the answer why and how this could change in the next few years. By the way, of the first 10, 6 of them, I think, or 7, are almost residential related. It just shows this growing demand for residential. And if I were to say anything from a locational perspective, I think what we're going to see is a shift where some office space will find itself much more in the residential market, or conversions into residential. The residential market is a problem globally, and it's one that I think the market will be focusing on in the medium term. I'm happy to go back to some of these, but I think that this looks very different from where it was many years ago. And if you compare this to the South African story, and I've been testing this in the South African environment, things really don't look that different here. There's a growing interest in this. I've wondered about student housing when there are no students, if all the students were to go on online, what it would mean. But I still believe that you will have student housing with good IT and Wi-Fi and that environment, whether that's in university towns or not. And I think that could make it quite an interesting investment class as we go forward. People still want to leave home. One of the things of going to university is it's your excuse to leave home. But I think that would be interesting. So my point is this, that in a lot of countries, the exposure to residential, the blue, is very, very low. And as The Economist had put out in, what is it, earlier in the year as well, saying, you know what, we've maybe we've had it wrong. We did things incorrectly in the housing market, and we're going to, and the point it's making is that we've never appreciated completely as an institutional investment class in a lot of countries. For example, especially in the UK, but if you're in the Netherlands, it is institutional investments that are in there. And I think that will fundamentally change. That scope with a very low exposure into the residential will grow as we go forward. Location-wise, it's becoming interesting. And again, let me give you the South African story about this, that we are starting to see investors moving or developing in a relatively few nodes, picking out the prime nodes. So for example, Sandton, Rosebank, and the Waterfall development in Johannesburg take up about, 20, 30, 40, 50, close to 60%, if not more, all property development in the entire country. So it just shows that location-wise, investors are targeting a few good nodes. And it comes back to my point. Choose your area, I think, increasingly carefully in this environment. Okay, trends in the retail property sector. I think much is being said about this. Much is, there are many views on how retailing will go. But I think what we're starting to see is shopping centers taking a different role. And I think I've made that point as well, where we believe that shopping centers only need shops, where we're going to see mixed use in our shopping centers. And I think what's going to be very interesting is the last mile of the e-retailing. In other words, in the South African context, everyone knows Amazon opening up stores, Take a Lot, becomes interesting, because what happens there is that your logistics is shifting closer and closer into the urban environment. So there's a good chance that you'll start seeing logistics sectors, warehousing much closer to where people live than may have been in the past. And by the way, from a property perspective, it leads to an interesting dilemma that is starting to play itself out here. For example, I saw the other day where a property owner wants a deal with the retailer to say, and said to the retailer, you pay me a rent, but you'll give me a turnover clause or a turnover, a rental that is linked to turnover based on your internet sales. Why? Because your physical presence does influence your e-retailing. They found that stores that have a physical presence actually do better in the e-retailing world. So there is that link. So the owner would like to see part of the upside that that shop is creating, but where the sales are not actually happening in the store itself. And that will lead to an interesting world in prop tech and the way that our leases are looked at. In other words, location, again, the theme of this evening, will start meaning how do you capitalize on sales that happen, A, in the store, but maybe elsewhere to a large degree. Or you have a good shopping center with a good e-retailing linked Santon.com or wherever in the world, shoppingcenter.com, and that you will actually go to that shopping center site and pick up your goodies. Now, the point here is, and you'll see the heading I've put here is co-working and co-living. And the point that I want to make here is this. I think that if we look at the property sector over the next few decades, it's going to alter considerably. And one thing which I think is going to happen is that in the past, as a property owner, one sold or let out square meters, square feet. And here's your square meters, and you put in your tenant installation, or you put in your desk, and off you go and work. I think that property companies will, in the years to come, start acting much more like hotel groups. In short, if I go to a hotel for 2 nights, my mindset doesn't say I'm renting 40 square meters for 2 nights. That's not what I'm buying into. I'm buying into a service. And I think what we're going to see is that the property game will be less about square meters, but it will be more about the services that are provided. It will be somebody who will say, I will come to your shopping center, or I will come to this office space, but I'm actually buying. Property has become a service, not merely a square meters, gross lettable area, or whatever you want to call it. Which then also means where the location becomes interesting, if that is the case. All of you will know that along a similar street, you can have a Hyatt hotel or a Holiday Inn hotel, location-wise, not far from each other, but very different rates, because it's the service. Hotels know everything about facilities manager. You only have to step 2 minutes into a hotel and you get the drift of the service. And so I think that property, the branding of property owners is going to become important. I know a Radisson hotel, I know a Holiday Inn, but most people wouldn't know who the owner is of a property, of an office block. You may have a little plaque of the management company, but do we really know the owner? Do we really brand ourselves as property owners sufficiently to capture that? Maybe in the past it didn't matter who you were. No one cared who the property company is. But I think that will fundamentally change as we start thinking different about property, the services that people want around property. So where's the interesting world in the property sector? The interesting world is where PropTech, Fintech, construction technology, and GovTech meet each other. And I think where you want to sit is somewhere in that world where these different techs meet each other. GovTech will be about the smart city. It will be about saying, I'm going to work somewhere because the city has got the technologies, I can function there. In other words, the technology will start finding its way between the property, the urban environment. Fintech will play its role. You know, as at Barclays, they illustrate to me, you look at your phone and your phone says, you can afford, based on your banking profile, you can afford a property of X. Not only that, but that app of the bank then says, how about looking at the following areas? And finally says, on Saturday, we suggest you go and look at the following 4 properties, which would be reflective of your profile. So I think we're entering into a very interesting world where this starts, and then construction that is building information, twin properties in the digital world. So we are entering a world where technology will move location-wise beyond the property itself. We often talk of CBDs, central business districts, but as you will see in the little box on the left, we're starting to see global business districts being developed. In other words, it comes back to the point that with globalization, whether maybe my banker sits here or sits in London or in Shanghai, maybe doesn't matter a great deal. But certain areas will grow in a very interesting way. In Africa, there are issues, but I think we are going to jump in Africa the technological divide very, very quickly. I think that in years to come, the farmer sitting in rural Kenya for $1 will invest in property and will be able to do so based on the platforms that are available. So where does property take us from? The old property story was about assets. The old model, asset intensive. You held the property. It took the Hilton Hotel a century to get to 610,000 rooms in 88 countries. It took Airbnb 4 years to achieve just about the same, but in more countries. 4 years. Now you may say, well, Airbnb is not a Hilton, but the point is that the structure is starting to change. The new model is going to be information intensive. It's not going to be holding that little property. It's going to be involved in technologies that combine, that are the Airbnbs of this world. And I think that we're going to start seeing things alter here. Scott, you should, this is my map of PropTech companies. I don't know if you see yourself as a PropTech company, but I think what you do is certainly in the PropTech world. So if you're not on here, it's totally my fault, because I think you should be here. But maybe it's the categories that we're dealing with. Scott, I see. Did you want to add something here?
So I mean, we're very much in the crowdfunding and finance space, probably the top one, and to some extent, it's the bridge between PropTech and InvestTech. But you know, I tend to always joke with people, these are all fancy terminologies, and in simple terms, it's just technology coming to the space.
Exactly. And so I think where it's becoming interesting is that we're seeing, and this is the South African PropTech map. We're doing one for East Africa at the moment. I'm busy actually one in West Africa, so we'll have the Africa PropTech. We're seeing players who are not actually property players often. In other words, there's an interesting space of property companies who are more and more involved in property, whether it's co-working, digital innovations, selling services, software, data. Now you may argue Property 24 isn't a property business in that respect. But I think we're seeing interesting new players entering who are fundamentally altering the property market at the moment. Are they all getting it right? Some are not. And I think where some are getting it probably wrong is they've forgotten the human factor in investment and in property. That last mile, you do want to speak to somebody. You don't want to see somebody. You want to be able to have a chat with somebody. These are often big decisions that people make. And I think to have somebody that you can talk to I think is going to become an important differentiator in this game. But sorry.
Interesting stats on that, Prof. We, you know, I've had my own property company since I was 25, and in the last couple of years, we thought it was all going digital and everything else, and then the research is overwhelming that there's a more than double conversion if you've got human interaction, even in e-commerce now. Like even if you're buying a book, if there's human interaction, because people trust more than they, you know, sort of trust buying just online, and so you need the social proofing. And you need the human interaction. And so I completely agree with what you're saying in that last mile. And Lee and I have witnessed it personally in our own business and how important it actually is.
It is. And I've been looking at many of these companies. Some are doing it well, but I think some have forgotten that. And especially also in the residential property market. You know, for many people, their home is the biggest asset that they'll buy. It's not something that you do every day. You know, buying a book on Amazon.com is something you can do, and you know what you're going to get. You have all the pages are there, and it's all going to be there. But these are very different decisions. So what is starting to happen here at the moment is that we've got real estate on the one side, we've got the investor on the other side. And sorry, I just had a helicopter flying over my house. I don't know why. I live close to a hospital, so I was getting nervous. But okay. But in my first 5 minutes of lecturing in real estate, I always say property is different. Property is fundamentally different from equity and cash and bonds because of poor data, location, liquidity, contracts, leasing, high transaction costs, and bulky investments. Largely. I think every single one of these is being altered at the moment. And I think that's what makes it interesting. I think that data is improving. I think we're getting a much better handle. Location, we've had long discussions about. It's always been about location. Probably will still be, but location is going to change. And I think what property is going to be about service, data, and yes, to some degree about the location. But I think it's going to look different. Liquidity is changing. I think that your opportunity to get into property which was difficult, is becoming increasingly. We have new products, whether it's REITs, whether it is and others. And I think that's going to move forward. Our contracts are going to change. Smart contracts in place, smart leases in place. I think if out of COVID-19, we may well see leases looking different as well. That people have seen that maybe some of the leases that we've been dealing with doesn't give the flexibility. We're starting to see what I call rollover leases for 3 years that roll from 3 years to 3 years onwards, unless if they're not canceled. So the lease is becoming shorter, but there's a break clauses that are going to play their role. So I think that's going to change. High transaction costs, and I think there's increasing work being done by players in the property market to reduce those transaction costs globally. And then the big thing is that property investments have always been bulky, you know, big numbers that you try to get into, you can't tokenize it. And I suppose ultimately what I put on top, there have been initiatives around block estates, polymath, secure tokenization of properties. I suppose that the one one big advantage of property, of playing the blockchain game on property, is that there is actually a property behind it. With Bitcoin, you're buying into a business case. With property, there is a property there. There is a property that has been valued, that has a value. And I think that that could lead to some interesting developments in the property game, which I don't think will happen that quickly in some other sectors of the economy.
Could I share a quick video with you and with the delegates? I'd love to see your thoughts on it. It's from the A360 is one of the top, it's run by Peter Diamandis in Los Angeles every year.
Must I stop sharing for a moment then?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, I'll just steal the screen back quickly. I'd love to just play this video for you and see what your thoughts on this, because it very much epitomizes what you're talking about. And so this is a video at A360. Peter Diamandis, who is sort of one of the leaders in this whole exponential technology space, is running this. It's not a great quality because it's actually from one of our shareholders who's literally filming it off her phone.
Pioneering work has been done in the last 24 months around the legality, the regulatory issues, who's allowed to buy it, what type of accreditation do you need to be a buyer. See, the SEC considers these things securities. You can't go out and just randomly sell it to everybody. Everybody starts buying fractional pieces of swampland in Florida. Because of marketing, the money flows off into crime and graft. So what you have is you have a kind of well-advised set of constraints within which you can now work. And there's a lot of clarity coming up. In fact, it's only in the next, say, 3 months, not 3 years, that the first real security token exchanges are coming online. Now, they won't have a lot of volume at first. So people are going to do what they always do with new technologies and say, well, why would I want that? Like with the internet, why would I want to watch video that's a postage stamp? Well, because it's not always going to be a postage stamp. The volume is going to start to grow exponentially. And in the coming years, you're going to find that most real estate will be done this way. Why wouldn't you? Why would you put money into something that has a lockup until somebody happens to buy it in some future time frame that you have no control of, when you can buy into at a very small amount and get out of it? So it's also going to democratize ownership. When you see a skyscraper going up, it's usually for millionaires and billionaires. If you have $1,000 or $100 and you want to put it in, and then you feel like you've made your money when it's worth $120, you can take it out. Most of the liquidity around real estate and illiquid assets is going to move this direction because it's just so sensible. It's hard to do it any other way.
We talk about the 6 Ds, right? And it's really the digitization of real estate, and that you're dematerializing it in one sense, both in this fashion and the virtual fashion. Philip and I talk all the time about having you need to have a virtual representation of your building as well in a virtual world that people will go and visit and use. There'll be one authentic one that you potentially own, just like it's a .com URL. And that's democratizing and it's demonetizing access to these things, right? So those 6 Ds are going to play out across every industry, and you may not imagine it yet in whatever industry, but people say, well, how are you going to demonetize and dematerialize my building? Watch, this is what's going on.
But need to set it up though.
So I just thought I would share that because I mean that's sort of happening all in real time at the moment, and these security tokens are taking what sorry, I'll stop sharing, but are taking what you're talking about and actually making it a reality now, where properties are being put on the blockchain and ultimately becoming security tokens.
Absolutely, and I think it will be an interesting world, because what we're also seeing is the digitization of property in a different sense. You'll have the digital twin of the property, so you'll be able to go through the property. Everything that you can see, you'll see different levels. You can go and look at the plumbing if you want. You can go and look at whatever you want in this property. And so your ability to do that becomes interesting. By the way, do I need to share again, or?
You can share again, please, yeah.
Okay, so I will just share this. Are we back there, Lee?
Gotcha.
Yeah, okay, Scott, yeah, okay. No, look, I think that your video makes the critical point here. And I think, you know what it's also about at the end of the day, is that between real estate and the investors, there were a lot of costs. You had the broker, the valuer, the portfolio manager, and so forth. You can start counting all the players in between. So I think what we're going to start seeing is that box, that space between real estate and the investor getting narrower and narrower, where the technologies are going to allow us to bring those players and reducing the number of players in between. And I think that's what blockchain can actually do for us. Will it be a Wild West to start with? Good chance it will be. It will be all over the place as we go into this. Does the regulatory environment reflect that world at the moment? The answer is no. Will it? I think it will. I think that technology will give us the regulatory environment. You know, it also reminds me, you know, with webinars, when COVID came in, everybody was on webinars. Everybody became a webinar expert. Well, I can tell you that many of them are gone, but Scott, you're still here. So I suppose the important point I'm making is that the professionals, as we professionalize things, they will be with us. There will be those who will come in and out who will have run the webinar during the middle of the COVID period because they had nothing else to do, low barrier to entry, but couldn't sustain it for very long in any case. But I think it's going to be a world, but I think the important thing is in this is to ensure to some degree that we are able to keep some of the characteristics that differentiate real estate from other investments. And I think that's going to be, because if property is just going to play the same game as the equity markets, people look at property for specific things. And I think that's going to be the interesting thing. Now, the view was, I mean, property because of location, because of long contracts, because of whatever. And how those worlds are going to find each other. But I'm totally convinced that, like I said, in 10 years' time, you will be, like I said, the farmer in Limpopo or in Kenya or wherever in the world will be able to buy property on their cell phone and buy 1 millionth of a shopping center for $1 or something.
Fascinating. We can send you our white paper that we finished in 2018 on that exact topic. Yeah.
But it's exactly that, and we will see. So, you know, I'm almost done. We've often spoken of homework and play. I've changed the wording slightly to homework and wellness. I think if there's something that starts coming out of COVID-19, it's maybe a sense of how do we ensure wellness around us, our work environments. How many of us have sat in our flats and said, how would I have reconfigured my flat or my house differently based on of being here locked up in this flat? And I think what I've put at the bottom here, a focus from parking bays to public spaces. Much of we had tracts of land, which we used for parking. Every discussion with municipality was about how many parking bays. I think that discussion may well start looking a bit differently as we go forward. It may take time, but I think the emphasis on public space, parks, and the value that gives us, especially if you live small. You know, micro flats at the moment, 20 square meter flats. In fact, I own a small flat, and I remember 10 years ago, I remember saying to myself, why did I buy such a small flat? It's so small every time I walked in. Now it looks pretty big if I compare it to some other flats. But it just shows that we're living smaller. But as we live smaller, our urban environment becomes more and more important. And thank you very much. I hope that we managed to get through some. I see there are quite a number of questions. as well. For those of you across the world, I couldn't put all the languages. I see we have people in Moscow and others, but I think I tried at least to be reflective of some of the languages that's in South Africa. I would like to leave it at that. If there are a few major themes that I hope that have come through this, and that is, Scott, when you started, you referred to an article where I said it was about data. I think it is about the data. I think that we have moved from a world where property was defined largely by highways and the car to a property sector where it will still be about location, but what will determine that location will be much more the issue of accessibility, not by car, but by Wi-Fi. And I think that becomes the important issue where, like I said, the shopping center largely relied on many people driving their car to one spot. And I think that may well change the way our cities work. I think it would be naive for anybody to think that things won't change, because then I suppose we wouldn't have got further than the marketplace in the first industrial revolution. But we've moved from the marketplace to the department store to the shopping center. It would be equally naive to think that the world's going to stop with the shopping center. There's something beyond the shopping center as well. And I think one of the issues that I did talk about when we looked at those different revolutions is that we will see a dissemination of economic activity wider than maybe we've seen in the past. And I think that will offer us opportunities in suburbs. Scott, you made the point about smaller towns as well. And I think that's important. So, and I think that will change how we think about property. And then the digitization will also influence where we invest. And we will be able to go globally through the opportunities that exist in the investment world, turning much more into the blockchain technologies and the investment world that lie around that. But still, I get invited probably to these presentations because the human factor maybe still is something worth considering. I think it will still play its role in the investment world as well. Thank you very much for your attention. And Scott, let me hand over back to you.
No, thank you, Prof. And there's some many comments coming through. Thanking you extremely for your time. I wanted to ask you a question, if you wouldn't mind, Lee. Let's put up the panel, because not the panel, the poll. Because I'm always interested in what people think based on what the Prof's just shared. The question I wanted to ask you, Prof, is that you said structural changes happen every 20 years. And just so that I'm clear, when you're talking about the structural change that we're going through at the moment, is that primarily based on STEEP, which was the acronym that you showed earlier, in terms of the 5 different areas?
I think, and that's the important point, that when I try, and like I said, I'm fairly skeptical. I've done enough forecasting, and I've got enough forecasts that have gone wrong to say, take a longer term view. Try to pick up those structural changes that are affecting the property market. And you're quite right that and much scenario planning gets run by the STEEP, the social, technological, economic environment, and the political environment. Keep a good eye on those, and I think it will start telling you the story. And you got to stand back. At what point? And it often happens, and I travel across the continent where I stand on a green field, and I said, are we really going to have a development here? Only to come back 5 years later and it's totally developed. In the 70s, would you have seen a Sandton for the South African investors? What would have told you that a Sandton was coming, that the opportunity was coming? And I think that the next game is not going to be necessarily a location game, although that will play a role, but I think it is trying to understand what sector. I think that's going to be very critical to understand in this environment, and that balance between the commercial and the residential. And by the way, I think that we'll probably see shopping centers with residential on top of them as we go. So you're quite, it's the steep.
Sorry.
Go for it.
No, I love what you said, Joe. You know, it's that we've all had that thing beaten into us: live, work, play. But I love what you wrote here: home, work, wellness, which I think is another a much better play on those words. So it's quite interesting.
Look, and I suppose the reason, and I spoke about co-working. By the way, co-living is equally important. I suppose many of us have been in a hotel room or in a hotel and said, I could actually live here. Just leave me here. Huh? It's small, but if somebody does my bed and cleans my place, I can go downstairs and eat. You know what? This is fine. Huh? Huh? And I'm not saying that totally flippantly, because it comes back to the service, that the residential may well become one around wellness and about service. You know, I got a friend in the US who bought a flat, and well, first of all, there's some flats being built in the US at the moment with no kitchens, because people, especially if you're one or two, it's cheaper to eat out than to cook for yourself. And people have taken a view that said, you know, if I had to balance that space being dedicated to the kitchen, just give me a bit more living space. And if I can, and if on the top floor of my apartment block, there are a few dining rooms that I could book when I get my friends. Scott, you would have to have a big dining room with the number of friends that you have. In this, but you know, you can invite your friends, but do I need a dining room every day? And people are questioning that and saying, for my wellness, what type of space do I really want? But it comes back to that point that I made, that property increasingly is going to be about the service. It's going to be about whether it's in the residential or in the office market. It's not just about square meters.
I love that. You know, are you getting the Capitec, you know, service or the Investec service, just as an example, whether it's banking, or are you getting the City Lodge service or the you know, one and only? I suppose that's a very good way of looking at it, you know.
Well, and to be honest, I think that a lot of the money will be made, maybe not even out of the rental, but out of the services. That's maybe where the money is going to be made, rather than necessarily on the typical rental that we've been dealing with.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Prof, you didn't say it this time, but you said it last time I was talking to you. You said the train was coming through the station, and you said it just depends which carriage is going to come first. And I was looking through my notes in preparation for this webinar, and I was wondering if that's something you used before. I love the metaphor, and I was wondering, with everything that's happened in the last 6 months, you know, with COVID and now the American elections, and, you know, what's happening with the sort of debt crises around the world, plus technology, plus social, plus political. What do you see as the train that's coming, and which carriages should we be looking out for?
Well, thank you. I mean, it's good to know that you listen to what I say.
Yeah, I'm a good student. I take notes and everything. These are my notes from the last presentation.
A good university for my university. We taught you to take notes. Good. Okay. But no, look, the issue is this, that first of all, there's going to be who passes through the train first out of the COVID environment, you know, and infrastructure moves through first. Offices, as we've seen, the last ones coming through have been the restaurants, the leisure, and the hotel industry, which are sitting. So I think that you do have these carriages coming through the station at different paces. If you take a longer term view, just on the economy, the residential moves first through. It is the most sensitive immediately to interest rates. As interest rates start shifting, you will see the residential sector move, and then you will probably see office, industrial, the retail sector. That's for the shorter term. And it comes back to the point that, which I said, every 20 years we have a boom. That must be differentiated from the investment booms. We actually have an investment boom every 10 years. You almost need one in between the 20 years for a number of reasons. You've got an investment boom, we oversupply, and then the second time around, we have enormous shortage, and we then move into the boom. So the question then, like I said, coming out of COVID, we have a certain sequencing that we're going to have to look for. I think that if one takes it from the longer term story at the moment, and I think if you just look at the table that I showed from the Urban Land Institute, I think that we will see in the immediate term the residential sector coming through. I'm certainly not arguing that there's nothing happening in the commercial sector, but I think there's going to be a consolidation in the commercial sector, and that there will be a focus on residential. And again, you'll see that in that list of residential, what you'll see coming through fairly quickly is the residential with services, whether it's students housing, whether it's retirement homes. Again, these are the sectors. And so in the short term, I think that those are the sectors that will probably come through. I don't know if that answers it.
Can I ask you a question in terms of, one of the things that I find interesting is you're dealing with students all the time and millennials, but you're also dealing with, big business in parallel. And there's quite a lot of talk at the moment around, this was an article that Prudential put out quite recently, actually, in July, around how DIY investing is fun but risky. And what we're tending to notice is a lot of the big corporates are trying to sort of keep people sort of the old traditional route, financial planners, et cetera, versus people actually doing it themselves. What is your take on not only the students that you're seeing come through, but you've seen sort of multiple different aggregates of students coming through over the years. But, I just can't see a future where my son, who's currently 8, is going to want to, talk to different people, I'm going to call them middlemen, versus actually being able to do it himself. But where do you see it? Where do you see us, if you take a property clock or an investment clock, to use your analogy, where do you see us on this clock between people wanting help, not trusting themselves, and then also being able to sort of invest and take control of their destiny?
Yeah, look, I think it's an interesting point that you're making. And I even see it with my own children. I said, go and see my portfolio advisor. Dad, we can do it. No, we don't need to talk to anybody. And still, I do a fair amount of work in my academic world, where I'm primarily interested in decision making, how we make decisions in the investment world, cognitive decision making, behavioral finance. It's a growing field where the old capital asset pricing models that we've been dealing with are maybe not giving us the answers. Now, why I'm saying that is that, and for those of you who've read the book Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Kahneman, and he makes a point that decisions that we make on a very regular basis, we can do it with our gut feels and we can go for it. But when it comes to decisions, things that we don't do that often, then we do need to get the advice and think fairly carefully at what we do. The Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. In fact, it's this book. Yeah. It's this one here. I don't know if you can see it there. Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, the international bestseller. And really it's a book by Daniel Kahneman, who actually is a Nobel Prize winner. And he does make the important point that the one thing we have to be very careful about is our own biases. And either we're going to have technologies that can overcome that, or we can have discussions with individuals. What I still sometimes have a view on, and that is that talking to an individual still gives you opportunities, a slant, a discussion around things that you won't pick up very quickly, necessarily on the internet. But will we have robot advisors? Yes, we will. Will we have people who spend their lives on the internet and that's all that they do? Of course they will. I even said to a few students not so long ago, I said, you know, if you all went and I put you in a spaceship and you looked at screens and we said, oh, you're off to Mars, would your life be very different, you know? And they sort of sniggered at me. And I said, well, I think they still admit that there's more than the world of the internet, but that world has changed. So to answer your question, Scott, I think that we're going to see increasingly a reliance on decision making, which is going to be electronic, but I think that when it comes to some of the bigger decisions that we're going to make, it comes back to my point where some of the technologies are falling, where some of prop tech is not working, is that there is still the need for that last mile human intervention.
I like that. I wanted to share with you something quickly here. Some others might have seen it before. I don't know if you've seen it, but if I log in here, I'm literally logged into the Wealth Migrate marketplace. You know, I can invest in the number one office tower in Tampa, America. I can invest in development finance in Cape Town. I can get involved in residential multifamily, which is institutional asset class residential. And what's really, really interesting is that if I just take, you know, one of these as an example, and I can basically go in, I can do it, set it up in multiple different accounts. I can put it in all the different currencies that I want to be able to see it. But what's important is I can go through and read all the information, download everything, read all the risks, get all the information. But let's just say that I hypothetically have now made my decision. I like this deal. I want to go along. I can, like anything, basically tick the different boxes. I would obviously download and read the subscription agreements because everyone does that, and basically agree and make the investment. And what you've just witnessed there in less than a minute was me investing in America through my wallet. You can see there that I've got my pending investments. And actually now I can do it in multiple different asset classes. So this is a structured note. We've got private equity, convertible debt. And so, yeah, I just thought I would show you, because it's one thing to visually it's one thing to theoretically talk about these changes, but it's another thing to visually actually see it, where someone can now build a portfolio around the world. They can go into their wallets and basically manage and see everything that they've got all in one place, all their different returns, truly allowing someone to become a global citizen now without having to leave the comfort of their couch, you know.
But the one thing that I will rely on, and I think that the world of brands is becoming important. I need to trust the brand. I need to trust it. And that's the important thing, you know, because my decision making is going to be my trust of the brand. And because if I don't have the rest, that is what I'm going to rely on.
So what's really interesting when you talk about the brands is that equally, you know, again, if you use the analogy of Amazon, what's important here is that we're not trying to do everything ourselves. A company like Feltman Equities is a $13 billion company with a 50+ year track record. And my point being is that it's actually going to be, and I agree with you, and by the way, we're nowhere near to where we should be. and or where the world's going yet, but it's these brands that ultimately people will be buying into and associating with. So it'll actually be a double brand, because there'll be the marketplace and the way to read it on a marketplace like an Amazon or an Airbnb, and then it'll be the brands of the partners that are actually providing. And I don't know if you agree with that or disagree with it, but
look, you know, when I fly an airline, when I buy a bottle of Coke, I don't have to think too much about it. When I put Shell in my car, I don't have to think too much about it. You know, I see the logo and I know what I'm buying. I suppose McDonald's have done that as well. Others have, where actually the brand brings a lot of information together in a very quick way. You know, it's in decision making, it's called heuristics, or in other words, rule of thumb. You know, and often when there's too much information, you need to have something that brings all of that together fairly quickly. And that's what a brand does. That's what a name does. What always scares me in the world is what I call the parallel universe. In other words, I've looked at everything, I've understood, but I've completely missed the whole story. You know, and the question is, I suppose that's what the brand does to some degree as well. It certainly reduces that thing of the parallel universe that you haven't seen.
No, I hear you. It's a fascinating to debate these things, and where the world is going, and particularly in the space, it's changing so fast, and yet human nature doesn't change at all. And that's what, you've got to keep. It's so interesting, because I notice you keep going back to these components around decision making, which are ultimately based on human nature, and that's really you've got to hone in and to get the success in the space. It's not only like
and that is why behavioral finance is a very fast growing sense, because I think we're starting to see what goes. But like you said, in your case, where you have two brands that you're playing, two brands that somebody invests in, that's what's going to give you. Why do we have a bank at the moment? We could send money to each other through email, but if I don't know the other guy, at least if I know the banking between me and the other person, I trust that. Why do we, with Uber, why do we need Uber? I could have a system where I go directly with the cab driver, but I feel comfortable to have the brand between me and the cab driver, and I'm willing to pay somebody for that. And I think that becomes the important story. The property is important, but who you deal with.
That's amazing. There's so many interesting comments and questions. Prof,
somebody's saying they're involved with heuristics and behavioral. Oh, good. I'm glad to see that. In fact, I haven't been following the chat, but there are now 99 of you. Whoa. I think there are more questions here than my whole academic year this year.
Well, that's what I was trying to say, is that it's a challenge for me, Lee, because there's so many good questions and things coming through. And I mean, I could talk for another 3 hours in this space, but yeah, I'm just conscious of the prof's time in terms of where we're at. So Lee, I'd like to just take a bit of guidance from you as to how you'd like to run it. I'd still like to, for those that want to sort of hang on at the end, I wanted to just share with them how we could practically show them some of the stuff that, how they could get involved practically. But obviously there's lots of questions here, Lee, so I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
Prof, I wonder if we could just have a couple of more minutes of your time just to answer some of the questions that have come through. We won't get to all of them, so please, if we don't get to them, I will try my best to get Prof to answer them offline and send the answers through to you, or get one of our team to answer. But let's just see how many we can get through in the next couple of minutes. We are conscious of your time. So we've got here, if Wi-Fi is a factor that will make fundamental difference with respect to location, can you see a disruption in the future coming about with the advent of satellites blanketing the areas? This is like the project that Elon Musk is working on and that we are led to believe is coming very soon?
Look, I think that will fundamentally change things. I mean, for those of you who go onto your iPad and go on one of those flight tracker apps, and you'll see that across Africa, you will see at 60,000 feet, balloons flying across this continent at the moment. Just go to East Africa, you'll see across the whole of Kenya, you'll see you can track them. They're just above what the planes fly at. But what they are doing, they are covering entire Kenya at the moment with Wi-Fi. For those of you who've been to Kenya, you'll know there's a very effective payment system, the M-Pesa payment system playing itself out as well. So between the location that we're seeing where people can work, study, will start to fundamentally alter with a much broader Wi-Fi coverage. It becomes all the more important in the South African case. I can tell you from our own experience that we've seen in South Africa over the last few months with education, that even at the university, you run a risk that 20%, if not more, of your students still don't have the access that they need. Which then means that many students have to move to areas where there is Wi-Fi. So if that is the question being asked, I think that the locational implications of that is important. Again, it's the same implication. I think, again, that Wi-Fi will influence the game in the same way that the car influenced the property sector. The suburbs that we saw in South Africa or in any city around the world, those suburbs were created by the car. And I think those same location issues will be influenced now by new technologies and the Wi-Fi technologies.
Is there likely to be some kind of return to the traditional village or town high street as a result of the current urban dispersal?
Interesting point. And if you start reading a bit what is coming through at the moment, some of the high streets are actually doing much better at the moment than they used to. And it became interesting, especially in the COVID period, is what they call shopping and getting out. You want to walk into a small store, buy your stuff and get out. You don't want to linger around a place with too many people for too long. And so what we've started to see is that, especially in smaller towns, where I can tell you 5 years ago, we were talking of the doom of the high street and the end of it. I remember walking into a small town, USA, where I walked into a shop, and I'd seen that town really go from bad to worse over the years. And suddenly I saw all these people in the shops. I walked in and I said to the shop owner, I said, so things have changed here. I said, who are you selling to? He said, I don't sell to anybody here. I'm only selling on the internet. But this is a great place to be. I'm on a high street now. And I go and have my coffee next door with my friends and so forth. So that high street is starting to play a role. But I am particularly excited about the role that the evolution. Many of our suburbs became dormitories, places where you went and you slept and woke up in the morning. I think that our suburbs could become very interesting places where there will be co-working space. Many of us don't want to work from home, but if you had some co-working space close to where you live, that's where you may go. So I like the idea of the 15-minute city, that everything where you live, you can do almost everything that you want in 15 minutes. And I think it's going to offer in South Africa opportunities in our townships, which could start evolving in interesting ways around call centers and others.
I live in a 15-minute city already. There's no way that's even 10.
In fact, I passed your parts of the world because once a year I do my State of the Nation trip. I get in my car and I go and drive. So I drove from Cape Town down the N2, past Knysna, through the Eastern Cape, dodged some of the cows and sheep, and got to Durban and came back, and via Bloemfontein, actually. I did a loop. And lots of small towns. I think many of those small towns have got opportunities which they certainly didn't have some time ago.
Oh, no, it's fascinating. It's there's so many people my age actually moving here because it's a great lifestyle for family, great schooling, great medical. You know, I've got 100. You know, it's interesting. When I first moved to Knysna in 2013, I didn't. It's so interesting what you said about Wi-Fi. It's probably my number one takeaway from tonight is that the Wi-Fi is the new car from 100 years ago, because when I moved to Knysna, they didn't have internet. Like literally, I had to fly to someone down from Joburg to mesh broadband lines together because it was just so slow. Whereas now I've got a fiber optic cable with 100 megs and just because of that, there's so many more people moving here because they can work anywhere in the world and yet their families can have the lifestyle, you know.
And then I think what's going to happen quite fast, although we've been slow at it, is that our phones will probably become direct satellite phones. The satellite phone is still an expensive game. But your phone there won't be a substation. Okay. And you'll have a direct satellite connection. I think we're going to start seeing that happening as well. But yes, our sense of space, I think, is changing. It causes all sorts of problems because the way we've been talking about catchment areas in property and how we define space and counting the households to determine the viability or something. I think we'll think differently.
So we have got 3 more questions, if you don't mind, Prof. The first one from Gavin is, where are we in the 20-year cycle you mentioned earlier on in the presentation?
Interesting. Okay. So the 20 years, so we had one in the 60s, then we had a boom in around 80, 81, 82, so 20 years later. Then we had a boom into around 2004, 5. Property prices were rising, residential were rising by 35% at the time, for many of you may recall, so in South Africa. So that means that from 2003, we shouldn't be that far from that. Of course, the present COVID environment, and I was getting nervous and I was saying, what are we missing here if you believed in those cycles? And of course, it comes back to my point that none of those cycles were really, apart from 2003, 2004, we had good, the South African story, we had good economic growth. But it comes back to the structural changes. And I believe that what we're seeing now are the structural changes. And I think they could move with us. So, you know, we may be a bit late from a GDP perspective, but, you know, I would still argue within the next 5 years, we're going to see some very different opportunities that are fundamentally structurally going to change our market. And yeah, so that's my view.
Great. Can you give some examples of the cities in South Africa where property and other taxes are increasing, and how do you find and evaluate the balance sheets of any cities?
Well, I suppose what you do is you'll get a fairly good idea by just following the budget of your city. I mean, cities do have budgets, and when they run out of money, they start spending a lot less. When the rate space is being affected. By the way, that number that I showed you of 10% is the average across South Africa. And again, there were articles this morning, I think it was, or in the last few days, warning that some of our cities could find themselves in financial trouble coming out of the COVID-19 scenario. National government is tightening up, and when national government tightens up, that money that flows down to provincial and local government is also affected. So are there certain cities worse than others? Yeah, but I think most you will see are pushing up their utility costs by well above, if not 2 times, the CPI at the moment. And the South African property sector has been very good at reducing operating costs. But what's making me nervous is that I don't think there's so much space in that environment. The other thing is the list comes out every year of the municipality where the Auditor General has not accepted their budgets or their expenditure for all sorts of reasons. And follow that list. I think that's your idea of the cities that are getting a clean audit and those that are not getting a clean audit. I remember, I think it was the Resilient Property Fund many years ago, where Des de Beer made the point that there were certain cities, I think it was, that he would not invest in. Just not go. I'm not going until these cities resolve themselves. But I think it had to do also with the opening of shopping centers and other issues. But do your homework in the same way that you look at a company when you invest in. If you're going to invest in a city, have a good look at that city. Yeah, that's all I can say.
And then the last question of the evening for Prof directly. One of the sectors that we haven't spoken about a lot and doesn't get spoken about a lot is retirement and retirement villages. What are you seeing in this sector at the moment?
Well, if you looked at that list that I showed, you'll see that the retirement homes are actually very high on the list. Now, there are good reasons for that, especially in the developed world, where we have an aging population. And the aging population is certainly the S of steep, the social dynamics that you want to follow. The interesting point is that it sits at the 2 sides of the spectrum, where on the one hand you have retirement home, and at completely at the lower end you've got the student market. Of course, they're at the spectrum of the age gap between them, but it comes back to the point that I think if you look, certainly in the US and Europe, retirement homes are with us. The growth, I think there's going to be a hiccup in that market, which has come out of the COVID-19, when we heard of some of the things, of the risks associated with some of the retirement homes. But I think that's something that we're going to have to deal with, and I think they'll probably operate slightly different than what we've seen in the past. But I'm quite happy with investments in the retirement home sector, retirement home hospitals. Is something that reflects the demographic. You must remember in the South African case, the demographics are different. We have a young population, and so maybe the leaning is more towards student housing at the moment than necessarily in the retirement home. If you're looking at the quantum, because that bulge, that age pyramid looks a bit different here, and what's going to come through it. And I think that in the South African case, we still have a lot of people who are making the transition from living at home with the parents to living alone. I always remind everyone that 70% of all the properties on the deeds registry in South Africa are valued at 800,000 rands and below. So there is an enormous property market that sits at the lower, certainly at the lower end of the South African property market, that actually is doing very, very well. Beating the inflation rate at the moment. So again, my answer then to that question is follow the demographics in wherever you are, and you'll pick up that trend.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you for your time. As always, the information that you share is so valuable. And as you can see with the comments that have come through, along with all the questions, everyone has really enjoyed hearing from you and your analysis of what is happening in property in general and where it is going. So thank you so much for honoring us with your time this evening.
And thank you very much for inviting me. And I haven't been able to get to all the questions, but I have seen your questions on the right. So thank you very much for your question. And Lee, get them to me, and maybe we'll find a way that at least you do get an answer. I'll spend a bit of time and go through them and make sure it's answered. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Really appreciate your time, and I think as you can see from all the messages coming through, that people really, really respect and appreciate all your knowledge and your sharing. So thank you. And what I wanted to finish off with was just to share. Really, I'm going to keep harping back on this, but as you said, the way the car changed, the property industry and basically society as we know it in the 20th century. How is Wi-Fi going to change it? And we've heard about it from a theoretical perspective, but I wanted to share just for the last 5 or 10 minutes or so, a practical opportunity where people can actually get to participate. Now, we've been talking a lot about the concept of Wealth 5.0, and it's interesting because there's a lot of overlap with what you shared there, Prof, on the digital 5.0. And there's actually a webinar that we've got coming up in the first week of November, where we'll talk a lot about Society 5.0, and I'm going to be talking about Wealth 5.0 in a lot more detail, the impact and the purpose. The value is all about your creativity and your value creation, your high touch. It's so interesting, the Prof spoke about the last mile, but it's about how can you have human connection with people? How can you use technology to make that happen? And then finally, at a digital level, it's all about problem solving and ultimately future proofing. The world has changed and has been changing over the last couple of years. And the whole concept of being an entrepreneur has changed now. And I will talk to you about the concept of Entrepreneur 5.0. And I'll also share with you what's happening with Investor 4.0, which was where it was all around venture capitalists. And now it's about Investor 5.0, which is all around venture builders. And ultimately, the investors, you and I, the farmer that's sitting in Kenya, will be the people that will actually be fueling and growing these opportunities. We'll be going into some detail around exponential organizations and how the businesses of the future, there's a paradigm and a formula upon which they work. And that's really where, we talk and say, at a joking level, but at a serious level as well, there's no reason why you can't have an Amazon of global real estate. I wanted to share with you just something that was really interesting. In 1965, the share market, the average share on the stock market was owned for 6 years. Today, it's 22 seconds. And how did that change? They call it the Big Bang. And a company called E-Trade came out in 1980. It democratized access to the stock market. Previously, you had to have a stockbroker, you had to have a lot of money, you needed to be pretty much probably quite close to New York as an example. And then E-Trade came out and democratized not only access to the stock market, but also geographically. And today, this is a $14-15 billion company. They call it the Big Bang because it was a massive transfer of wealth around the world as this took place. And when you look at real estate, the average home ownership in America is currently 8.7 years. And you saw that list of prop tech companies that hopefully the Prof will add us to as well. But it's not going to take 40 years for it to change in terms of, and it's interesting what you said as well. And I made a note here around keeping the characteristics of real estate investment, keep some of the characteristics which differentiate it from other investments. And I think that is so key because where liquidity comes in, some see that as a positive and some see that as a negative. In terms of where we see it going with a meta marketplace is that ultimately it's about personalization. You've got platform at the middle, you've got global marketplaces, you've got local marketplaces, you've got real estate to the top left, diversification to the top right, different genres to the bottom left, and community to the bottom right. And for us, why we talk about an Amazon is that ultimately you've got that platform at the center, whether it's an investec that is being driven by the platform. It's all about this digitization and ultimately people want personalization. I don't want to just go to Amazon and have anything and everything. They call it the everything store. I'm not interested in that anymore. I want it to be personalized for me. And that's really what big data and machine learning is allowing us to do. And so what we've done is where you've got Wealth Migrate, which is a global real estate marketplace. You've also got the Wealth University, which is really what tonight's all about, and the learning. You've got the Wealth Movement. We've got Genius U, which was a private equity investment. We've got Cashbox, which is structured notes. We've got Zuza, which is a local UK developer. We've got the Enterprise Property Development Fund, which is actually a BEE operation here out of South Africa. We've got Wealth Diversification. We've got the Private Wealth, which is literally launching, which ironically is going to be that top-end service as we discussed. Sapin, and I could keep going in terms of all of the different operations, all the localized platforms. With time, there'll be millennials in wealth, women in wealth, and even Sharia compliance in wealth. And so, although using the same technology, allowing people the ability to be hyper-personalized. And one day, interesting, we believe that we want to, one of our visions is to make investing as simple as a swipe of a finger from $1, which will ultimately allow that Kenyan farmer to invest that $1 in a shopping center. And that's where we talk about the Amazon of personal wealth. The team we've built now is a pretty comprehensive team from around the world across many different geographies and understandings. I'm not going to talk too much about our numbers, but I think the exciting thing for me is that we've done over $600 million and we've got people in 152 countries, which really shows you how the world has changed. If people want to read about the reports and the financials, they can go through it all. But in simple terms, at the Global Wealth Group, there's three things that we're aiming for. The first is to increase our transactions. We've got an average fee and we've got an average transaction size. And so our target is $100 million in the next 5 years in revenue, which would put us at $1 billion valuation. And to do that, we need to increase our transactions. We want to do 1 million transactions in a calendar year at an average fee, with the buy and the sell side being monetized at 5%, with an average transaction of $2,000 per transaction. Now, that means that someone might be at $1 and someone else might be at $1 million, but the average will be 2,000. In terms of exit strategies, we can talk, and our team of wealth consultants can go through this, but in simple terms, there's two major ones or three major ones that we're looking at. One is a strategic sale, one is a dual listing on the London Stock Exchange and or the Hong Kong Stock Exchange or the New York Stock Exchange. And the third, depending on where the world is over the next 5 years, it could even be a tokenization of the business itself. And then really to finish off, what we learned and what we copied many years ago was Salesforce, where rather than going out to the venture capitalists, it's very much about this venture builder. It's about working with the community. And in 2014, we formed our wealth partners. We've now got, I don't know, Lee, what the exact number is now, but it's probably about 875 people from around the world, 42 different countries that have actually joined our purposeful and profitable journey. And really what we've allowed people to do is, rather than wait until they invest in Facebook or Amazon at an IPO level, most of us don't get access to invest in private equity, but actually to be able to invest in companies that are in that growth stage. And last year we did it with Cedars, which is a UK regulated equity crowdfunding platform. We raised, you can go and check it all out. It's all regulated by the UK FCA. And we raised $2.5 million from a number of investors all over the world. And really what the opportunity lies now, with COVID happening, with the structural shifts that the Prof refers to, and with Wealth 5.0 happening at an accelerating pace, was that we've actually gone through an opportunity and literally copied what Amazon did 20 years ago, which is offering people the ability to get a convertible debt within the business at 7 to 10% interest paid per year for 5 years. In terms of where the business is, it'll be a breakdown between $2 million in debt, $3 million in equity, which will allow the business to continue its strategic acquisitions and commercial acceleration, a business within an ecosystem. We're targeting to 10x the metrics, dramatically on path to the 100 million plus IPO. The returns are based on the size of the investment. The interest is paid quarterly, and it is secured against the group real estate assets that are currently around $4 million. So a $2 million debt has a 200% cover or 50% loan to value. In terms of why we're doing this and how COVID helps, there's actually a lot of local and global entrepreneurs and institutions that are really wanting to take advantage of this fintech, prop tech, invest tech, whichever space you want to call it, and then ultimately collectively exponentially growing the meta marketplace. And so really what we're doing is enabling that venture builder to bring them on to build that business with an ecosystem and ultimately become a global incubation hub. And I've spoken about the dual listing and the IPO that we're looking for and the growth potential over the next 5 to 7 years, which is really riding these long-term trends which are now coming to fruition around the world. Lastly, I think what's important is that every acquisition or strategic partner that comes online will be joining the worldwide wealth community, will be benefiting from the digital technology, will be significantly increasing their revenue and profitability, and equally everyone else collectively. So it's very much a win-win in a symbiotic situation. And so the opportunity for people to participate is that we've got 3 levels. One is a silver level, which is a $25,000 investment. It's a 7% interest paid in US dollars and a 3% discount off the current price. So what that means is you secure the share price now, but only pay in 5 years. It's the same as securing shares in Amazon and only paying 5 years. And I'm not saying we're Amazon, but I'm just saying the concept. Gold is, at the gold level, it's $100,000 or an 8% interest. And at the platinum level, it's $250,000 or 10% interest. And you can see the different discounts there. Those are actually premium preferred shares. And then finally, just in terms of the notes, it converts in 5 years. So you can come on the journey for 5 years. We're keeping interest in the bank to protect the income streams. The capital is protected against the real estate assets. And then finally, there's over $800,000 that's actually come through in the banks. There's another 400,000 in contracts and quite a lot of warm commitments in terms of where we're at. And then lastly, I think just in terms of what people want to understand is where's that investment going? 48% of it's going into the CapEx, so investment in the platform and the technology, 24% into the products, branding, and marketing, 18% into the marketplace rollout and human capacity, the OPEX. And then finally, and it's so interesting what you spoke about with the I've just got to get the acronym right here. ESG, environmental, social, and governmental. 10% is going into the compliance and corporate governance because that corporate governance component is so important going forward. And so those that are interested, you can actually go to the landing page. Lee will put up the link there. You can go read all about it. You can watch the videos and download the material. I would highly recommend that you chat to a wealth consultant. We spoke about the last mile. Talk to a human being. This is not for everybody. I want to be very clear. This is generally by invite only, and we've got to make sure that your needs and our needs are aligned in terms of what we're doing. And then if you're a believer in technology and want to go, I've actually shared with you tonight, but you can literally go on the platform and actually do it on the platform in terms of what you're looking at. And then lastly, if you want that human connection, Lee has very kindly run tonight's webinar and organized everything, and that is her WhatsApp number if you want to reach out to her directly. So just in terms of the final thing, we've got these webinars coming up, 2 more webinars for the rest of the year. One is, and I think that date might be wrong, it might be the 3rd of November, but anyway, we'll be finalizing that date, Lee and I. And then lastly, we've got, and maybe Prof, if putting you on the spot here, but David Orban and Willem are 2 amazing people, and it might be fascinating to have an open panel conversation around ending off the year in 2020. It's been such a fascinating year. I got a very interesting post sent today, and it's a little kid decorating his house for what do we call it now at the end of October? It's getting late. Halloween, and there's this big sign that says 2020, and the little kid's saying it's the most scary thing I could think of for 2020, and I thought it sums up 2020 pretty perfectly. So these are just the last 2 webinars for the end of the year. And so really in conclusion, luck is when preparation meets opportunity. And I think tonight, hopefully, you've understood a lot of these big trends that the Prof has shared. And I think what a lot of people get the opportunity now is to benefit over the next 10 years, where, consider yourself lucky because your preparation can allow you to take advantage of the opportunity. And then really the 3 reasons why people join our community. The first is they want to make a profit. They're business people, they're investors, they want to make a profit. The second is they want to be part of a global community. it's actually very hard to find like-minded people, and it's incredible to be part of a global community that's learning and growing. I know Andrew Cooper's online tonight. He phoned me just yesterday to tell me Capitec and Easy Equities are doing a deal, and why don't we be talking to them? You know, that's just an example of how a community can exponentially grow. And then finally, you know, it's not only about profit, but also about purpose. And our purpose is to allow the 99% to be able to invest like the top 1% using technology and smart investing. And I believe in our lifetime that vision of making investing as simple as a swipe of a finger from $1, allowing that Kenyan farmer to invest, is truly going to be a reality. And whether it happens in the next 10 years or the next 20, I can't guarantee, but it'll definitely happen in our lifetime. And so there are those links again if you want them. I think, Lee, from my side, I'm very conscious of the time. And so I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone that's been online. I've loved the energy and all the questions. As I said, it's always so difficult, Prof, because when you share, there's so much value that you share, and we could probably talk for 6 days. And I really do hope that you equally allow me to reciprocate the value to your students, because I'm very, very proud and very, very grateful to having gone through the UCT construction, you know, the BSc construction management program, because it really set me up and put me on an incredible path. And hopefully, if nothing else, all the people that have got value out of tonight is testament to you and the department and the work that you guys have done. I was one of only 10 people to graduate back in 1998. And it's incredible what you've achieved and the impact you're having around the world. And so I just wanted to thank you, not only for your time tonight, but equally for putting me on this path 22 years ago, well, and a bit longer, because I started in 1995, so it's 25 years ago. And thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And I tell you, it'd be crazy if my students didn't know about this and the new ways of investing also in property. And as you said, be part of a community. So important. Doing things together. That's maybe one thing we start losing in the IT world. But I think doing things together is such an important concept that we have to keep on doing. And I think this is a good example of togetherness. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, Lee, that's all for me. Thank you. Thank you very much for everyone's time. I really appreciate it. And as always, we'll share the presentation if anyone wants it with the different links. But Lee, over to you.
Thank you very much once again, Scott and Professor Veruli, for your time. And thank you everyone for being online. We really do appreciate you spending the last 2 hours with us and really engaging in the conversation as we went through that. As Professor pointed out, we had over 199 comments that came through during the webinar, which is awesome. So thank you very much. As always, we ask you, if you found value out of this, to please share our upcoming webinars and the recording of this webinar with anyone that you feel could have value. The only way we are really going to accomplish spreading the word is by the use of our community. So thank you once again. We hope that you are surrounded by people that are loving you. Please be safe, look after yourselves, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar on the 4th of November, to be confirmed, as Scott did say. But we will send out all the information via our different channels for you all. So take care, everybody. Good night, and we'll see you all soon.
That's one.